This content is AI generated for informational purposes only and should not be directly used for clinical decision-making.
Hello and welcome back to the Neurosurgery Hub podcast. I'm Dr. Aris, Senior Attending in Pediatric Neurosurgery.
And I'm Dr. Alara, Research Fellow. Today, we're looking at a fascinating new study from Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology titled Outcomes of Selective Dorsal Rhizotomy in Ambulatory Children and Young People with Cerebral Palsy, a scoping review.
This is a timely piece of work, Alara. As we know, selective dorsal rhizotomy, or SDR, is a permanent, irreversible neurosurgical procedure. Its primary goal is to reduce spasticity in the lower limbs of children and young people with bilateral spastic cerebral palsy. But the conversation around SDR has been evolving. We aren't just looking at the Ashworth scale anymore. We're looking at how these kids actually live their lives.
Exactly. And that's what this scoping review, led by Deepti Chugh and her colleagues, including our colleague Christian Aquilina, really digs into. They used the JBI scoping review methodology to look at 214 published papers between 1993 and 2024. Their goal was to map out which outcomes are being reported using the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health Framework, or the ICF.
For the residents listening, the ICF is that biopsychosocial model that moves us beyond just pathology. It looks at body functions and structures, activity, and participation, all within the context of environmental and personal factors. So, Alara, looking at these 214 papers, where is the neurosurgical community spending most of its energy?
Well, the data shows we are still very much rooted in the impairment-based model. Out of the 214 studies, a staggering 93%, that's 199 papers, focused on the body function and structure domain. We're talking about muscle tone, muscle weakness, joint mobility, and deformities.
That's not entirely surprising. As surgeons, we want to see the physiological change, the reduction of spasticity, which is the direct result of the rhizotomy. But the paper suggests that just because we've reduced spasticity doesn't mean we've necessarily improved the child's life in a holistic sense. What did they find regarding activity and participation?
It drops off significantly. Activity outcomes, which include things like execution of a task, mobility, and self-care, were reported in 58% of the studies. But when we get to participation, which the ICF defines as involvement in a life situation, like playing sports or engaging in leisure activities, that was only reported in 15% of the literature.
15%. That's a significant gap. If we tell a family that SDR will help their child, the family is usually thinking about their child being able to play with friends or go to the park, not just a 2-point drop on the modified Ashworth scale.
Precisely. And it gets even narrower when you look at quality of life. Only 8% of the studies reported on QOL. Even more surprising was that only 2%, just 4 studies, mentioned individual goals for the SDR surgery.
That's a critical point for our residents to hear. In clinical practice, we should be setting individual goals with these families. The paper mentions that SDR, when combined with intensive physiotherapy, can improve gross motor function and independence. However, they also highlight that systematic reviews have found limited evidence on the longer-term effectiveness regarding functional mobility and self-care. There's a bit of a conflict there with some longitudinal observation studies that do report gains compared to the natural history of CP.
The author suggests this uncertainty makes decision-making for families very challenging. Because SDR is irreversible, we need to understand what outcomes are most relevant and meaningful for the children and their families. The review points out that there has been a small shift in emphasis towards participant-reported outcome measures in the last decade, but it's not yet the standard.
Let's dive deeper into the ICF domains they discussed. When they talk about body function and structure, what were the most common measures?
It's the usual suspects: spasticity measures, range of motion, and gait analysis parameters. But the review notes that while these are objective, they don't always correlate with how a child functions in their home environment. For instance, the activity domain includes mobility and self-care, but many studies focus more on the capacity to do a task in a clinical setting rather than the performance of that task in daily life.
And that brings us to the contextual factors the paper mentions, environmental and personal factors.
Right. Environmental factors like social, physical, and legislative support, and personal factors like age, education, and motivation. The review found inconsistent reporting of these. Understanding the relationship between, say, muscle weakness, a body function, and the child's motivation, a personal factor, is essential to tailor our postoperative management.
I found it interesting that the paper highlights a paucity of studies providing the actual perspectives of the children and their families. We often talk about them in our papers, but we don't always use validated tools to capture their experience of the outcome.
Exactly. The interpretation of the study is quite clear. Impairment-based outcomes remain the primary focus, but we need a more holistic, meaningful capture of change. They specifically call for the development of core clinical and research outcome sets to standardize reporting across the lifespan.
That standardization is key. If every center is reporting different metrics, we can't accurately compare the long-term effectiveness of the procedure. For the residents listening, when you're consenting a patient for SDR, remember that you're not just consenting for a reduction in spasticity. You're embarking on a journey that involves intensive physiotherapy and a hope for increased participation in life.
And according to this review, we should be incorporating all domains of the ICF to truly understand that journey. The authors mention that identifying measures used at various stages of follow-up is essential for clarifying the impact of SDR.
Let's talk about the what this paper adds section. It really summarizes the state of the field. First, that impairment-based outcomes are still the focus. Second, there's inconsistent reporting of contextual factors. Third, the lack of family perspectives. And fourth, the urgent need to include and report individual goals in clinical practice.
It's a call to action for researchers. If we are only measuring tone and range of motion, we are missing the biopsychosocial reality of cerebral palsy. We need to look at how SDR affects a child's ability to engage in their community.
It's also a reminder that SDR is part of a larger ecosystem of care. The paper mentions that SDR combined with intensive physiotherapy is where we see those improvements in gross motor function and participation. We can't view the surgery in a vacuum.
One thing that struck me in the results was the number of studies, 119, or about 56%, that reported outcomes in 2 or more domains. So we are getting better at looking at the interplay between, say, spasticity and activity, but the jump to participation is the one we haven't quite mastered yet.
And that's where the future of our research needs to go. We need to use the common language of the ICF to facilitate communication between us, the therapists, and the families. It allows for better data comparison across countries and promotes family-centered care.
This scoping review really sets the stage for the next decade of SDR research. We need more qualitative data, more focus on quality of life, and a standardized approach so we can finally answer those long-term effectiveness questions that families are asking.
Well said, Alara. To wrap up, for our practicing neurosurgeons, keep focusing on those individual goals. For our researchers, let's start pushing towards those participation and QOL metrics. And for the residents, remember that the most important outcome isn't always found on a goniometer.
Thank you for joining us on the Neurosurgery Hub podcast.
We'll see you next time. End of dialogue.